Welcome back occultists to a new video. These are a collection of paranormal stories that will give you chills. I suggest you keep the lights on for this one. If you are new to the channel, make sure to like and subscribe for more content. Let's begin. I never imagined that a casual night out with friends could turn into a nightmare that would haunt us forever. It began as an impromptu gathering. Mike, Jenna, Sarah, and I all decided to have a few drinks near an old, abandoned house at the edge of our town. The house, shrouded in rumors and urban legends, stood as a testament to forgotten times, its once grand structure now a crumbling relic. As we settled on the overgrown lawn, the house loomed over us, its broken windows like dark, watching eyes. We laughed and joked, trying to dispel the eerie atmosphere that clung to the place. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease began to creep over me. I remember Mike daring us to explore the house. Driven by alcohol-induced bravado, we agreed. The front door creaked open, revealing a decayed interior swallowed by shadows. Our phone flashlights pierced the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The house was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each more decrepit than the last. Graffiti covered the walls, and remnants of a bygone life lay scattered on the floor. It was Jenna who first heard the whispering. Faint and rhythmic, it seemed to emanate from the bowels of the house. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and fear, we followed the sound to the basement. The air grew colder as we descended the rickety stairs, the whispering intensifying. What we found in the basement will forever be etched in my mind. A group of people, clad in tattered robes, stood in a circle around an altar. On the altar lay an assortment of strange objects and symbols that I couldn't comprehend. The robed figures chanted in unison, their voices a discordant melody that made my skin crawl. We were paralyzed with fear, watching this macabre ritual unfold. Suddenly, one of the figures turned and saw us. His eyes, dark and frenzied, bore into mine. With a guttural shout, he alerted the others. In a panic, we turned to flee, but they were upon us. They moved with a feral agility, their faces contorted in fanatic fervor. They spoke of a pagan god, an ancient deity they worshipped, and their intention to offer us as sacrifices to gain its favor. The fight that ensued was a blur of terror and desperation. Mike was the first to fall, overwhelmed by their numbers. Jenna and Sarah screamed, fighting back with all their might. I remember running, the sound of my friends' screams echoing in my ears. I stumbled through the dark corridors, the cultist chants haunting my every step. I didn't know where I was going, my only thought was to escape that hellish place. By some miracle, I found my way out and into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the main road. There, under the streetlights, the reality of what had happened hit me. I collapsed, my body shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. The police found me there, babbling incoherently about the house and the cult. They mounted a search, but by the time they got to the house, it was empty. No sign of the cultists, no sign of my friends. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The investigation turned up nothing. The cultists had been meticulous in covering their tracks. The only evidence of that night was the bloodstains on the basement floor, a grim reminder of the horror we had encountered. The days following were a haze of grief and disbelief. I was questioned repeatedly by the police, but my account seemed too fantastical, too steeped in horror to be believed. The town buzzed with rumors and theories, but no answers came. I visited the house again, compelled by a morbid need to understand, to find some semblance of closure. The building stood silent, a cryptic monument to that night's terror. As I walked through the empty rooms, the memories flooded back, overwhelming me with guilt and sorrow. The laughter and dreams of my friends, now just echoes in a forgotten void. Sleep became a distant memory, each night a struggle against the nightmares that replayed the events in vivid, gruesome detail. The faces of the cultists haunted me, their eyes filled with a fervor that was beyond human. The thought of what might have happened to my friends in those final moments was a weight that crushed me. I started researching, delving into the history of the house and the possible origins of the cult. My search led me down a rabbit hole of ancient pagan beliefs and forgotten deities, a world where human life was offered to appease otherworldly beings. The more I learned, the more I realized the depth of the cult's madness. I found references to a god they worshipped, a deity that demanded blood and sacrifice. The rituals described in dusty tomes mirrored the scene we had stumbled upon. It was a practice that dated back centuries, a dark tradition passed down through the ages. I began to feel watched, a constant presence lurking just out of sight. Paranoia gripped me, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cult was still out there, that they were aware of my inquiries and that I was treading on dangerous ground. One night, as I sat in my room, poring over old texts, I heard it, a whispering outside my window, a familiar, sinister chant. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. Peering outside, I saw them, the robed figures standing in the darkness, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. I realized then that the horror wasn't confined to the abandoned house. It had followed me, or perhaps it had always been a part of me since that night. The line between my world and theirs had been irrevocably blurred. In a panic, I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the figures were gone, leaving no trace behind. The officers looked at me with a mix of skepticism and pity, their eyes suggesting that grief had finally broken me. But I knew what I had seen. The cult was sending me a message. I was not free from their grasp, not yet. Perhaps, never. I moved away from the town, hoping to escape the memories and the lingering threat of the cult. But the shadows of that night followed me. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind, brought a tide of fear that they were near, watching, waiting. The faces of my friends haunted my dreams, their voices a constant reminder of the life we once shared. Mike's laughter, Jenna's vibrant energy, Sarah's kindness all snuffed out in a night of unspeakable horror. The guilt of surviving, of leaving them behind, was a burden that weighed heavily on my soul. I wondered if there was anything I could have done differently, any way I could have saved them. As the years passed, the incidents became less frequent, but the fear never truly left me. The experience changed me, leaving a scar that no amount of time could heal. The carefree person I once was had been replaced by someone who jumped at shadows and doubted every stranger's intent. Sometimes, in the still of the night, I would find myself back at the house in my dreams, reliving the horror, trying to find answers that were always just out of reach. The abandoned house was eventually demolished, the land left barren, as if to erase the nightmare that had occurred there. But for those of us who had experienced it, the horror lived on, a dark chapter written in the annals of our lives. I learned to live with the fear, to build a life amidst the shadows of the past. But I never forgot, and I never stopped looking over my shoulder, for I knew that somewhere, in the dark corners of the world, the cult still whispered the name of their pagan god, and their eyes, filled with lunatic fervor, still searched for their next sacrifice. I've always been drawn to the quiet solemnity of graveyards, which is why I took a job as a caretaker at the Old Willows End Cemetery. Nestled on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods, it was a place that seemed untouched by time. The ancient tombstones, some so eroded their inscriptions were illegible, told stories of lives long past. It was peaceful, or so I thought, until the incidents began. My first unsettling experience happened on a foggy October evening. The cemetery, shrouded in mist, took on an ethereal quality. I was locking up the main gate when I heard the sound of soft weeping. Thinking someone had been locked in, I ventured back into the graveyard. The weeping grew louder, more sorrowful, guiding me deeper into the maze of tombstones. Finally, I reached the source, an old, crumbling mausoleum. The weeping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I approached cautiously, but found the mausoleum empty. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken grief. Shaken, I left quickly, unable to shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching me. The next occurrence was even more disturbing. I was doing my rounds one evening when I noticed a figure standing by a grave. Dressed in outdated clothing, he appeared to be mourning. I approached, offering my assistance, but as I drew closer, the figure vanished into thin air. I stood there, stunned, staring at the empty space where he had been. The grave he had been standing by belonged to a man who had died over a century ago. These incidents were just the beginning. Soon, I began to experience them with frightening regularity. Shadows darted between the tombstones, always just out of sight. Unearthly whispers filled the air, words indiscernible but filled with malice. The once peaceful graveyard had become a place of unrelenting unease. One night, something compelled me to visit the cemetery's oldest section, a place where the earliest settlers of the town were buried. The moon was full, casting a ghostly light over the weathered headstones. As I walked among them, the ground beneath my feet suddenly gave way, and I fell into a shallow pit. Panic set in as I tried to scramble out, but then I noticed something in the dirt, a decayed hand, its skeletal fingers reaching up as if trying to grasp something in the air. Horrified, I realized I had fallen into an old, unmarked grave. I managed to climb out, but the image of that hand haunted me. The following nights were plagued with nightmares, each more vivid and terrifying than the last. I dreamt of the dead rising from their graves, their decayed hands reaching for me, their hollow eyes filled with accusation and sorrow. The days were no better. The cemetery seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The air was perpetually cold, and a sense of dread hung over the place like a shroud. I began to feel watched, followed. Whispers followed me, echoing my name in a taunting chorus. Then came the incident that pushed me to the brink. It was a particularly dark night, the moon obscured by thick clouds. I was making my final rounds when I heard the sound of digging. I followed the sound to a fresh grave, the earth still unsettled. To my horror, I saw a figure, shrouded in darkness, digging into the grave with its bare hands. Frozen in fear, I watched as the figure unearthed a coffin and pried it open. The sight of the corpse inside, its skin waxy and eyes open in an eternal stare, made my blood run cold. But it was the face of the corpse that sent a jolt of terror through me. It was my own. As I stared in disbelief, the figure turned to me. Its face was a void, an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. It spoke in a voice that was a chorus of the dead, "You belong to us now." I ran, the chilling laughter of the figure echoing through the graveyard. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. But even there, I couldn't escape the feeling of dread that had taken root in my soul. Sleep became an elusive specter, and when it did come, it brought no respite, only nightmares. I began to see the figure from the graveyard everywhere, lurking in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. My life became a waking nightmare. I was constantly on edge, jumping at the slightest sound. The boundaries between the living and the dead blurred until I could no longer tell what was real. In desperation, I sought the help of a local priest, hoping for some form of exorcism or blessing to rid me of this curse. He listened to my story with a grave expression, then agreed to accompany me to the cemetery. We arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows between the tombstones. The priest began his prayers, sprinkling holy water as we walked. But as we reached the old mausoleum where I first heard the weeping, a cold wind swept through the graveyard, extinguishing his candle. The whispers returned, louder than ever, forming coherent sentences now. "Leave us," they hissed, "this is our domain." The priest, pale and shaken, persisted with his prayers. But then, with a sound like the cracking of the earth, the mausoleum's door swung open, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to consume the light around it. From within that darkness, the figure emerged, its presence so malevolent it was almost palpable. The priest stumbled backward, his prayers faltering. "Your prayers cannot save you here," the figure intoned. "This place belongs to the dead, and soon, you will join us." I felt an invisible force pulling me towards the mausoleum, the whispers growing into screams in my ears. In a last act of defiance, I turned and ran, leaving the priest behind. I heard him scream, a sound that was abruptly cut off, replaced by an eerie silence. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the cemetery, far away from the town. I've never returned, and I never will. But the scars of those experiences remain. I still hear the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night. Soft and insidious, creeping into my thoughts. Shadows seem to linger longer, and the darkness feels denser, as if hiding some unseen presence. I've tried to move on, to rebuild my life elsewhere, but the memories of Willow's End Cemetery haunt me. It's as if a part of me never left that place, as if a part of me is still trapped there, among the whispering dead. Some nights, the nightmares are so vivid that I wake up expecting to find myself back in the graveyard, the moon casting its pallid light over the tombstones. I see the figure, a sentinel of the damned, waiting to claim me for its own. The experience has left me with a profound sense of the thin veil between life and death. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, searching the shadows for something I can never quite see. The world feels different now, darker, more foreboding. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of the evening, I think about the priest and what might have happened to him. Did he find his way out, or is he forever lost to the darkness of the mausoleum? I dare not return to find out. I've tried to share my story, to warn others of the dangers that lurk in forgotten places like Willow's End. But most dismiss it as the ramblings of a traumatized mind, a ghost story to be told around campfires. But I know the truth. I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadowy corners of reality. Willow's End Cemetery is one such place, a nexus where the veil is thin and the dead whisper in the wind. So now, I live my life looking over my shoulder, forever haunted by the shadows of the past, forever listening to the whispers of the dead. The graveyard may be behind me, but its curse lingers on, a chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, and some doors are better left closed. It was the winter of 2004 when the events that would haunt me for the rest of my life unfolded. I was living alone in a remote cabin in the woods, a retreat I'd sought for some much-needed solitude. The cabin, inherited from my late uncle, was rustic and isolated, the nearest neighbor miles away. It was the perfect escape from the cacophony of city life, or so I thought. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of settling in and the peacefulness of nature. However, as the days passed, a sense of unease began to grow within me, an inexplicable feeling that I was not alone. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow blanketed the world in white, I was jolted awake by the sound of knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, listening intently. I rationalized that it could be someone lost in the storm, seeking shelter. But deep down, I knew that was unlikely. I crept towards the door, every creak of the wooden floorboards sounding like thunder in the silence. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the swirling snow. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I mustered my courage and opened the door, only to find the night empty, the snow undisturbed. Shaken, I convinced myself it was the wind playing tricks and returned to bed. But sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the eerie incident over and over. The next day, I found footprints in the snow around the cabin. Not human, but too large and irregular to be any animal I knew. They circled the cabin, as if whatever made them was surveying the place, or me. As the days progressed, so did the occurrences. I would find objects moved, hear whispers in the dead of night, and feel cold spots in random parts of the cabin. The atmosphere grew heavy, charged with a malevolent energy. One evening, as I sat reading by the fire, the temperature dropped suddenly. The fire flickered and dimmed as if being suffocated. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving across the room. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, and as it moved, the whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. The room felt oppressive, as if the air itself was being drained of life. In a panic, I fled to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. But the sense of dread followed, seeping through the walls. I heard scratching at the door, soft but persistent, as if something was trying to get in. I spent a sleepless night huddled under the covers, praying for dawn. When morning came, the room was as I had left it, but the sense of terror lingered. Determined to understand what was happening, I delved into the history of the cabin and the surrounding area. My research led me to a chilling discovery: the land the cabin was built on was once the site of a tragic event. Decades ago, a family living here had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of unsettling rumors and folklore. The locals spoke of a curse, of shadows that consumed the living. Armed with this knowledge, I resolved to leave, but the cabin, or whatever resided within it, had other plans. On my last night, the worst of the occurrences happened. As I lay in bed, the air grew icy cold. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent. They were calling my name, beckoning me. I tried to resist, but it was as if I was being pulled by an invisible force. I found myself standing in the living room, the fire long dead, plunged in darkness. The shadow was there, larger and more defined, its presence suffocating. It spoke in a voice that was both a hiss and a whisper, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "You cannot leave," it said. "You are part of this place now." In a moment of sheer terror and clarity, I realized that whatever haunted this cabin was not just a remnant of the past, but a living, malevolent entity, feeding off fear and despair. With every ounce of willpower, I broke free from its hold and fled into the night, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. As I drove away, I saw the cabin in my rearview mirror, its windows glowing with an unearthly light, and I knew that I was lucky to escape with my life. The road back to civilization was a blur, my mind reeling from the nightmare I had just lived. When I finally reached my apartment in the city, the sense of relief was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. The horrors of the cabin had left an indelible mark on me, a shadow that lingered in the corners of my mind. I began to experience nightmares, vivid and terrifying, reliving the events at the cabin with disturbing regularity. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me back from the woods. In the days that followed, I noticed strange occurrences in my apartment. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker without reason, and I would often feel a chilling presence, as if I was being watched. The line between reality and the macabre memories of the cabin began to blur. One night, as I sat in my living room, trying to distract myself with a book, the temperature dropped suddenly. A familiar sense of dread washed over me. I lifted my eyes from the page and froze. There, in the corner of the room, was the shadow. It had followed me, transcending the boundaries of that cursed place in the woods. It whispered my name, its voice a sinister echo of the sounds I had heard in the cabin. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. The shadow grew larger, its form more defined, a swirling mass of darkness with an insatiable hunger. In a desperate attempt to escape, I threw the book at it and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. But the shadow seeped under the door, an unstoppable force of evil. I realized then that there was no escaping it. The entity from the cabin was not just tied to that place, it was tied to me. I had unwittingly become a conduit for its malevolent energy, a prisoner in my own home. Days turned into weeks, and the shadow's presence became a constant torment. I was losing my grip on reality, jumping at shadows and flinching at every creak and whisper. In a last-ditch effort to rid myself of this nightmare, I sought the help of a local medium. She listened to my story with a grave expression and agreed to perform a cleansing ritual in my apartment. The ritual was intense, the air charged with electricity as she chanted and burned sage. The shadow writhed and twisted, its form becoming more erratic, as if it were fighting against the force of her words. Finally, with a deafening shriek that seemed to shake the very foundation of my apartment, the shadow dissipated, leaving behind a palpable sense of emptiness. The medium warned me that such entities are not easily vanquished and that I must remain vigilant. She advised me to move on from the horrors of the past and fill my life with light and positivity, to weaken the shadow's hold on me. I followed her advice, slowly rebuilding my life, surrounding myself with friends and activities that brought me joy. The nightmares became less frequent, and the sense of being watched gradually faded. But even now, years later, in the quiet moments of the night, I sometimes feel a chill run down my spine, a reminder of the darkness that once consumed me. I know that the shadow is still out there, waiting, biding its time. The experience has changed me in ways I cannot fully explain. I've learned that some horrors are not confined to remote cabins in the woods, that they can follow you home, lurking in the shadows of your own mind. I share my story as a warning. Be careful where you seek solitude, for you never know what lurks in the shadows, waiting to be awakened.